Hey everybody, welcome back to the salon. So, a while back, over on my 13 o'clock Tomes of Terror book review series, I actually did a review of Adam Neville's 2015 giant chunker of a novel, No One Gets Out Alive, which I absolutely loved. It was actually one of my very favorite horror novels in recent memory. I mean, it's great. The whole thing about the book, like, not only were the setting and the characters really like so vividly drawn that you could just see them and even smell them like at times, but just this kind of like ever escalating spiral of horror that our poor protagonist had to go through was just like excruciating. And it's just like her stuff just got worse and worse and worse, and you were just kind of like, oh my god, this poor fucking woman. And it was just like really, really harrowing. So then in 2021, Netflix announced that they were going to be producing an adaptation of No One Gets Out Alive, and I actually was excited about seeing it, but then for whatever reason I sort of forgot about it, like in the rush to watch other things, I guess. And I guess it like just metaphorically kind of like fell between the dusty couch cushions that constitute my brain these days. You know how that goes. But recently, however, I realized that I hadn't done an adaptation breakdown on here for a while, and I know that some of you have said that you like those, like comparisons between books and movies, and I enjoy doing them as well. And since I only read the novel maybe like a year and a half ago, and still remember it fairly well, and since I was still curious to see how the Netflix film turned out, because I didn't really hear a lot about it, I decided I was going to go ahead and give the movie a look and then, make this video here comparing it to the source novel. Now, obviously, because of the nature of this comparison, this discussion is inevitably going to contain spoilers, so consider this your warning. So the movie was directed by, I guess, like a relative newcomer named Santiago Mangini, I guess is how you pronounce his last name. He doesn't have like a Wikipedia page of his own, so, I don't think he's done a huge amount of stuff. But I will say, like, the film, just as a film, is pretty solid. It's actually, like, pretty creepy, well acted, things like that. But I am going to say that it takes many liberties with the original book. So do not go into this movie expecting it to be like a slavish adaptation of the story, because it differs in a number of very, very significant ways. And if you're in some kind of weird class where you have to like give a book report on the Adam Nevill novel and you're like, oh, I'll just watch the movie, you're gonna get an F, because it's like really, really different. Now, I will say, like, the broad outlines of the tale, like the core story of it, which is, essentially desperate young woman in dire financial straits ends up staying in this rundown boarding house run by two really sketchy dudes, and subsequently there's like both human and supernatural monsters like coming into play. All of that, the core story, that's the same, but pretty much all of the fine details wildly diverge, like in pretty much every way you can imagine. And the final third of the book is actually not adapted into the movie at all, which I guess I can understand why. Like, I'll get into that in a little bit. But yeah, like the final third of the book like isn't even in there. It only pretty much goes up to like the 2/3 point and then ends. I will say too, and I'm not really sure if I'm the best judge of this, because I did see a couple of comments, because there was a couple other videos that I watched, or a couple other like articles that I read that compared the two things, and some people commented, they're like, oh well, I'm glad I read the book beforehand, because if I'd watched the movie I wouldn't have known what was going on. But I'm not really sure if that's the case. I mean, the movie seemed pretty straightforward to me, but then again, I read the book, so I kind of knew what was going on. But so I'm not really sure if I don't think you would have had to have read the book like to know what was going on. I thought it was pretty obvious, but if you've just seen the movie and you haven't read the book and you didn't know what was going on, then let me know, because I'm kind of curious. Like I said, I did read the book, so I can't really judge. So probably the largest deviation of many is the location where the story takes place. The novel, of course, was penned by Adam Nevill, who is a British writer. So the story in the book is set in Birmingham, England, whereas the movie adaptation actually transplants the story to Cleveland, Ohio. In the movie, the main character is a young woman named Ambar, who came to the United States illegally from Mexico after the death of her mother, who she had actually forestalled college to care for. So like her mother finally died after she had taken care of her, and then she like came to the United States, which she'd been saving up to do. Now, Ambar has a job like working in like a sweatshop type situation. And she does have, I guess, like a small lifeline. She has like a financially successful distant relative who I think is a cousin of her mom's, or she calls him like her uncle, but I think it's like her mom's cousin. And his name is Beto. And he lives in the United States, legally, and it looks like he's married to a white woman and stuff like that. And he had never met her before, like she came to the US, but she was like the only relative she had there. So he's actually set her up with a job interview, like with a guy that he knows. So she does kind of have a lifeline in that situation. However, though, Ambar does not have an ID, and that means, because she came here illegally, obviously. So this is going to hinder her chances at getting a better paying position, obviously, because, you need an ID, like, to get a job. And it also leads directly to the horrific living situation that she finds herself in. Because she can't produce identification, in short, the manager of the motel that she's been living in, like, basically throws her out. It's like, look, produce ID or you can't stay here anymore. So she has to, like, kind of seek out cheap accommodations elsewhere where they're not going to ask too many questions. Now, in the novel, by contrast, the young woman, the protagonist, is actually named Stephanie, and she actually is not an immigrant to England. She is English, but she has just moved to a new city. Like, she just moved to Birmingham, and after she essentially, like, cut ties with her old life, like, several towns away. So her dad has died, and her stepmother, who I think is a drunk, if I remember correctly, and also always hated her, pretty much ordered her out of the family home. It's like, look, your dad's dead, like, get out of my face, I never liked you. Stephanie has also just broken up with her boyfriend, Ryan, and has lost touch with the few friends that she had previously. Now, as the story goes forward, her ex-boyfriend, Ryan, he ends up playing kind of like a similar role in Stephanie's ordeal as Ambar's Uncle Beto, like, does in the movie. Like, they're just like that one person that they can call, like, that's the only person left in their life, and they're kind of like estranged. So it's a similar kind of situation. Like Ambar, Stephanie also didn't attend college. I believe it was mainly because she couldn't really afford it. And she's basically just been working a series of low-paying temp jobs, like whenever she can manage to find one, like at call centers or giving out food samples at grocery stores, shit like that. So in both the book and the movie, the women answer an advertisement for like a cheap room for rent in a boarding house, and it's billed as women only. And also in both mediums, the house has, let's say, it's seen much better days. Although I will note that the house in the novel is way more, like, disgusting and unlivable than the one in the movie. The movie version of the house is, like, pretty dumpy and, like, pretty shabby, but not really all that bad, like, all things considered. Like, I wouldn't mind living in it, like, if it was super cheap. It actually kind of more resembles, like, a very faded, like, Victorian house. It was, like, once really beautiful, because it has, like, antiques and shit in it. Whereas the book version is also Victorian, but it's kind of, like, more of a dirty shithole that has just like a bunch of mouse shit and like cheap broken crap in it. Now, the proprietors of the boarding house also differ quite a bit between the film and the novel. In the book, the house is run by two, like, essentially chavs is what they are. Look that up if you don't know what that is. Their names are Knacker Maguire and his cousin Fergal. Now, Knacker is, like, right from the get-go, a sleazy creep, very obviously. He's very arrogant, he's very trashy, he's very condescending, he's very manipulative, and Stephanie is, like, pretty much immediately, like, put off by him, very wary of him, but she doesn't really have many other options at this point. Now, in both the book and the movie, the proprietor says, oh, well, I know it looks like a dump now, but we're going to be fixing the place up. And, in both book and movie, like, the women very reluctantly, like, fork over a deposit. Now, Fergal, who we meet later on, is essentially like the muscle of the operation, as his equivalent Becker is in the film. Fergal is actually described as 7 feet tall and freakishly skinny in the book. In the movie version, the Knacker equivalent is named Red, and although he does come across as like a little bit brusque and kind of obviously shady, he's not nearly like the very, very obvious like field of red flags like Knacker is. And at times, I will say that he almost comes across as like slightly sympathetic, or like he might be like an okay dude, which Knacker in the book absolutely never does. I mean, Knacker is just like an absolute piece of shit, like with no redeeming qualities whatsoever. Red's brother in the movie, Becker, they were cousins in the book, as I mentioned, is just like, he's not 7 feet tall or super skinny. He's just like a big hulk of a guy, like with a beard, who is clearly pretty dangerous and probably crazy also. So both the book and the movie have, the main protagonist start to hear things like pretty much the first night that she stays there, like women's voices saying help me, like creepy sounds like coming out of the drain, crying, that kind of stuff. In the novel, Stephanie pretty much, I mean, this freaks her out so much because I think in the novel, and I don't think this was in the movie, but in the novel, like there's like a weight on her bed, like there's somebody invisible like sitting on the bed, and she's like nope, and she's just like immediately goes to Knacker and asks for her deposit back so she can find another place to live, like literally like the first night. But of course, Knacker will not give it to her, and she doesn't really have anybody else she can really turn to. Like that was the last of her money, and she doesn't get paid again until the end of the week. Now, in the movie, Ambar also asks for her deposit back, but not so much because, like, she's terrified of the haunting, although she does, like, hear and see, like, creepy shit, but she's a lot less, you know what I mean? It's not kind of like in the book, like I said, she saw creepy shit in the room and she's like, yeah, no way, I'm not staying here, which most people probably would. Whereas in the movie, like, she saw some creepy shit, but it was kind of ambiguous, so she's like, whatever. But she does ask for her deposit back, but she mainly does it because she has a coworker who she thought was her friend at work, and her coworker had promised to get her a fake ID, but she actually like steals all her money, like all the money that she had left over. And so Ambar is now not going to have the ID ready for like her big job interview, which is coming up on Friday. So, so she needs the money back, obviously, so she can get the ID and like hopefully get this better job. So she goes and asks Red. Now, Red initially tells her that he already spent it, like too bad, so sad. But then later on, he actually kind of softens and says, oh, okay, well, I'll try and get it back to you, even though Becker doesn't want me to, all this other kind of stuff. In the book, though, like, things play out a little bit differently. Like, Stephanie, as I said, like, insists I am not staying in this haunted-ass room. No, thank you. And Knacker, he kind of, like, pretends to be magnanimous. And he's like, tell you what, I'll give you a better room. And supposedly there's no strings attached. But he later uses this fact as leverage, like telling her, oh, well, by the way, now you owe me more rent for the nicer room that I gave you out of the goodness of my heart. Like, haven't I tried to be nice to you? You came and complained about ghosts and stuff, so I moved you to a better room and all this other kind of stuff. So he's kind of like trying to guilt her into that kind of shit. Now, in the novel, the supernatural story, as in like the ghosts and everything, is absolutely there, but it's kind of like in the margins, just kind of along the edges, like for the first 2 acts. But most of the horror in the first 2/3 of the book actually comes from the very human monsters who are like running this house. Basically, you find out that Knacker and Fergal are essentially human traffickers. They're bringing desperate women into the house to pimp out and basically like forcing them to comply if necessary. They would like beat them up. They threaten to throw acid in their faces. It's like, it's a bad situation, right? Now, by contrast, there is really only the very, very barest whiff of this in the movie. There's one scene in the movie where Ambar meets 2 Eastern European women who specifically came to the house as prostitutes. Although in the movie, I think it's implied that they just came there for Red and Becker. Like, you know what I mean? I didn't get the sense that they were here like pimping them out because they didn't really go any further with that. Like a similar thing happens in the novel. Like she meets these 2 Eastern European women like in the kitchen or whatever. But it's made more clear in the book that these 2 women specifically came to England. Like they came here to work in this house as a brothel. So they knew that they were getting into sex work. They're just mad because apparently Knacker had told them, oh, it's this really nice house and it's all done up. And then they get there and it's a shithole and they're pissed off about that. So they feel like he went back on a promise. But they knew that they were going to be sex workers. There's really none of that in the movie. They don't really do the whole human trafficking angle at all. Like I said, there is the scene with the 2 Eastern European prostitutes. It's implied that they're prostitutes because, Ambar asked them, well, what work do you do? And they're just like, you know what I mean? Like that. But like I said, the implication was that they were just hired by by Red and Becker, like, for the night. Like, you didn't get the implication that they were, like, pimping them out to other people, you know what I'm saying? Because you never see any other people, like, come into the house, whereas in the book you do. And in the book as well, like, Knacker also at first, like, attempts to kind of, like, soft sell Stephanie and, on the idea of becoming a prostitute herself, like, basically, like, wheedling her. It's like telling, oh, you could make so much money, you'll be able to pay me back all the money you owe me, like, for me moving you to the nicer room, all that kind of stuff. And then, like, when she refuses, he essentially, like, locks her up and, like, attempts to force her, you know what I'm saying? In the movie, the threat of being forced into sex slavery, not really addressed. That doesn't really come into play. It's not really part of the plot. And Ambar is never approached by Red or, like, asked anything like that. Now, the house in the novel also has a really different backstory than the one in the movie. In the book, the house was actually once occupied by, like, a spiritualist group, like some kind of weird, like, cult that contacted ghosts and stuff. And then later on by a father-son team of pimps who are also murderers. Knacker actually tells Stephanie that him and Fergal inherited the house from their parents and they're fixing it up, but this is actually a lie. They basically just took it over because it was abandoned. After they got out of prison, they essentially just, like, squatted there or moved in because it's, like, a kind of a shitty neighborhood where nobody lives. And they're kind of hoping to make, like, all this money by opening up a brothel in it. Now, in the movie, on the other hand, it does appear that Red and Becker did inherit the house from their parents, because there are a number of photos of their parents, or you presume of their parents, and you do find out later that it is their parents, in the study, like on the ground floor, and a bunch of their things are still in there. The parents, it's established, were archaeologists, and they studied Aztec artifacts, which plays into kind of like the monster big bad, like at the end of the movie. And Red tells Ambar at one point that his father killed his mother. So Ambar actually does see both ghosts at varying times over the film and witnesses this murder kind of like play out in the house, in ghostly form, and in what's actually essentially like a pretty spooky scene. It is like, this does have like cool ghost effects, and like the ghosts kind of look cool and creepy. The movie also makes it obvious that a stone box that was discovered by the archaeologists in the 1960s contained some type of like monstrous demon. Several of the characters have nightmares about this box, like while they're in the house. At the end of the movie, you actually discover that all of the women that Red and Becker have lured to the house are being sacrificed to this demon. Now, this demon is specifically the real Aztec warrior goddess. It's Papalotl. I don't remember if that name was mentioned in the film. I just saw that like in the supplemental material about it. But I don't remember if they specifically named it. That's who it's supposed to be. And basically what they're doing is they're sacrificing the women in exchange for Becker getting like health power-ups, you know what I mean, and healing. Like it heals his body like every time he sacrifices somebody. Essentially what they have to do, like the women are tied on this sacrificial altar down in the basement, and the goddess, who looks like this kind of like really bizarre spider moth human hybrid thing, it's like a pretty weird looking fucking monster, like crawls out of the box and like eats their heads, like just pops their heads off like that and just leaves the rest of their bodies there. Now, I was under the impression that the monster's sustenance actually comes from the memories or like the thoughts of the people that she eats, though I might be totally wrong on that. I might just be like reading into it, but that's what I thought was going on. Now, the house in the novel also has a monster, kind of, but it's much more of like an English folk horror type of deal. Like it's sort of like an ancient fertility goddess, who they call Black Aggie. Now, in the book, Knacker and Fergal know about the supernatural shit that's going on in the house. Like, they know about Black Aggie and they know about all the ghosts there. But it's kind of almost more a case of their actions and the actions of the people who lived there before are more kind of like influenced by Black Aggie so that she can feed on the misery of the inhabitants, rather than the men specifically and quite literally like sacrificing people to a monster like happens in the movie. And as I mentioned, the whole Aztec connection, that's a film-only invention. The mythology in the book was much more like a European or like an English witchcraft pagan kind of thing. Now, the end of the book and the movie also differ in pretty drastic ways. In the movie, Ambar is actually like set to be sacrificed. She's on the altar and everything, but she is able to escape. and ends up killing Becker and then feeding Red to the demon. Although, like, over the course of the thing, her uncle Beto and several of the other women in the house, they ultimately perish, like, during the thing. But while all of this is going on, like, Ambar's ankle gets broken, like, Becker stomps on it and, like, breaks it. Actually, what's a pretty nasty scene. But once Ambar gives Red to its Papalotl, her injuries are healed. So at the end of the movie, Ambar's kind of like, she's on her way out of the house, but then she like pauses before she opens the door, and that's pretty much the end. Like, it's left ambiguous as to whether she's actually going to leave or whether she's decided to stay there and, like, I guess feed the demon herself, like continuing the cycle, which I didn't mind the ambiguous ending, but I kind of feel like everything that we know about her character, like, leading up to that point, I don't think that she would even consider, like, staying there. And, like, even if the monster did give you, like, super healing powers or whatever, it's like, you're gonna have to, like, sacrifice, get people's heads bit off. It's like, I wouldn't do that, you know what I mean? Like, for anything. So, and she didn't seem like the kind of person that would either. So I'm not really sure, like, why they left the end of it ambiguous like that. It didn't bother me that much, but I was just saying I'd never thought that she would do that, like, or that she would even consider it. Now, in the novel, Stephanie escapes from the house after, kind of a prolonged struggle or whatever. But then the story takes, like, a hard turn and actually, like, jumps ahead 3 years. So in the interim, like, in these 3 years, Stephanie has actually, like, sold her story to the press, like, about this house and about, I don't even remember if she said, like, about the ghosts and stuff, but just about, like, all the sex slavery that was going on there. And she wrote a book about her experiences there, and the book and the press and everything like that have essentially, like, made her a millionaire. So she's, like, really rich now. So she changed her name to Amber Hare, so she's living under, like, an assumed identity, and she moves to this kind of, like, isolated compound, like, in the south of England. And she has, like, a bodyguard, and she has, like, all the latest and, like, top of the line security technology, all that kind of stuff. Because Stephanie is still really fearful about Black Aggie and all the ghosts that haunted the house back in Birmingham. And as it turns out, she was, like, right to be afraid, because the spirits of the past are, like, not finished with her, and they actually do kind of, like, come to get her later on. Now, from a storytelling standpoint, I can absolutely see why the filmmakers kind of chose to leave out this final section of the book. And it's a big section. Like I said, it's about a third, maybe a quarter or a third of the book. It takes place, like, 3 years after, like, the main section. I mean, it is a really big tonal change. And I'm not really sure, like, movie audiences would have really been on board with it. I think, like, it would have taken the movie in a completely different direction, and it would have seemed like a different movie, and people would have been like, what the fuck, why is this going like that? I mean, even in the novel, it was kind of like a strange twist that at first, like, kind of seemed out of left field. But then, like, as the final act was playing out, it started to become a lot clearer, like, how it tied in thematically, like, with the first portion of the book. And it ended up being, like, kind of an interesting study in contrast, because it was examining the differences between the vulnerable, desperately poor Stephanie, like, at the beginning, who ended up, being embroiled in these situations that she didn't have any agency in because she didn't have any money, so she couldn't really, like, didn't have any options. So they were contrasting that with the later, like, the wealthy but very traumatized woman who, because she had all this money now, like, seemingly had all her problems solved, but was nonetheless, like, still in the thrall of forces beyond her control, because now there was, like, all of these supernatural forces, like, still out to get her. So was the 2021 movie No One Gets Out Alive a good adaptation of the novel? Yes and no. I will say that I thought it was a pretty decent movie in its own right. The acting was pretty solid. The cinematography was actually quite beautiful. It had that really nice, like, rich teal and warm amber combo that I always find like, really visually pleasing. And the appearances of the ghost is actually, like, pretty subtle and pretty eerie. Like, it didn't have, like, a fuck ton of jump scares or anything like that. I do think the ghosts were kind of, like, shown too much, and they started to, like, lose their scariness after a while, but I did like the subtlety of them just, like, being in the background rather than, like, jumping out in people's faces. I thought that was a lot nicer. I also did appreciate the character of Ambar, who, she was, like, in a bad situation that was, like, getting worse and worse, but she was still, like, real resourceful and made, she didn't really make any stupid decisions. She just kind of made the decisions she was, like, forced into. And I did like the angle of making her an illegal immigrant, because it made her situation, like, that much more fraught. I mean, she couldn't go to the police for help, and she always kind of had the threat of being reported, like hanging over her head, that people could use to like manipulate her. In the novel, like Stephanie didn't really have that added difficulty because she was English, even though she just moved to a city where she didn't really know anybody. And so arguably, like at least toward like the beginning of the book, like Stephanie probably could have got out of a few situations maybe more easily than Ambar could have. Having said that though, Knacker and Fergal were terrifying characters in the book. And the situation that Stephanie found herself in the book was exponentially worse than what Ambar experienced in the film. I will say that. As I mentioned, Stephanie was essentially like locked up and threatened with physical violence and having acid thrown on her and stuff like that if she didn't pretty much like agree to be a sex slave, you know, and she had all the ghosty shit like happening too, which was terrifying. Now, Ambar also had like the hauntings to contend with and, you know, the later threat of being sacrificed, but pretty much like for the first 2/3 of the movie, she's pretty free to come and go. And she was like never threatened with rape or never said, hey, we're going to throw acid on you if you don't become a sex slave or anything like that. And she didn't really see anything horrible happening to any of the other women in the house, which did actually happen in the book. And in the movie, like even Red, while still unquestionably a villain, did kind of seem to feel bad about what him and his brother were doing and almost at times like appeared to consider letting Ambar get away. You know what I'm saying? I mean, in the movie, like both Red and Becker were terrible people, clearly, but compared to Knacker and Fergal in the book, they were pretty mild. So I mean, both the film and the novel kind of examined the same theme, I guess, talking about like the dire consequences of poverty, how the lack of money can leave you open to all kinds of abuses. The book obviously came at this from a much more British, like working class perspective, while the American setting of the film kind of delved more into the immigrant experience and also kind of included a little bit as a little bit of a side thing, kind of like an uncomfortable note of how some immigrants actually come to the country and succeed, but then sort of like shit on those that try to come after them. So there was like a little bit of that going on. So it's not real heavy handed, but there was like little hints of that in there too. But like I said, I do like that they made her that because it would make her experience that much more difficult, like coming here. So in spite of those differences though, I think the core theme of financial insecurity leading to exploitation was like surprisingly similar in both mediums. So while I do wish that the movie had maybe stuck more with the folk horror vibe of the novel and had maybe worsened Ambar's circumstances to be more akin to what Stephanie experienced in the book, it was, like I said, a decent movie overall. Though I'm going to say if you're a big fan of the novel, you'll probably be disappointed at like the excessive number of changes that were made from like the original source text. You know, I'm going to say, and this probably shouldn't need it because this is true in almost all situations, but the book is like miles better. And I would actually recommend that, you know, pretty unreservedly. Though keep in mind that the novel is a lot darker and a lot more violent than the film. I kind of feel like the film, while good, was more like creepy. It wasn't when the book, whereas the book was a lot more like harrowing and dark and horrifying, and like it just got worse and worse, and it was like just really seedy and everything like that. The movie didn't have as much of that. It was like a lot more restrained, and it was, you know, it didn't go as far, you know what I mean? Like the book went a lot farther than the movie did. But I will say that the movie was like a really interesting take on the book, even though there were, like I said, a huge amount of differences, some of which I understood, some of which I was like, I kind of wish you hadn't done that, whatever. But, you know, I'm not too mad at it because it's actually like a pretty decent movie in its own right. And had I just watched it not knowing that it was based on a book, or not knowing that, you know, not knowing anything about the book, then I probably would have really enjoyed it because, you know, I wouldn't have known how different it was. So maybe that's what other people's experience with it will be as well. So that will do it for this installment. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Let me know if you like these kind of like book to movie comparisons, because I actually do really like doing these, even though they take me a little bit longer than some of the other ones do. Like I said, because usually I have to watch the movie and read the book and do this whole other thing. And the book reading takes a little bit longer than watching a movie does. But, you know, let me know if you'd like me to do it. And actually, if you have any recommendations in that regard, then let me know that as well. Might take me a while before I can get to them, but Recommendations are always welcome. So remember to like and share if you enjoy this content, and please subscribe to Scare Salon if you haven't already. Also, remember to go over to scaresalon.com, which is my website. I post all kinds of written content over there about horror books and movies and all kinds of other horror-related content on there. Usually put up a new post every single day. And right here on this channel, I usually put up 2 new videos a week. So, stick around and see what else comes up. I'll see you guys on the next one. Bye.
And now was acknowledged the presence of the Red Death.